there's a report that's been circulating the last couple of days about Kurt Cobain's death. They are now saying it was most likely a homicide, not suicide. So, that's a big deal because not only did every news station across the world immediately the day of the police report getting released to the public. I mean, I cannot tell you how many news reporters and people in entertainment to mention depression right away with his suicide. Like, he was such a depressed guy. He wanted to kill himself numerous times. He talked about it numerous times. And, he clearly couldn't handle life. Now, I've watched a ton of interviews with Kurt Cobain. I was not a big Nirvana fan, but I do have nothing but respect for that band and Kurt Cobain. I'm a huge grunge guy, and I can't begin to tell you the impact that had for all of grunge after Kurt Cobain was found dead. And after it was labeled as suicide, you had multiple people talk about depression and how depressed Kurt Cobain was. Now, again, I've watched plenty of interviews with Kurt Cobain. In his own words, he does mention he wanted to kill himself. But not because of depression. Because he had some sort of illness in his organs or stomach tissue. I don't know if they were considered to be ulcers, but the guy was in tremendous pain, according to his own words. That made him contemplate killing himself. And I also can look up, therapists talking about suicide, and the thing they'll say the most is if somebody's wanting to kill themselves, they most of the time will not talk about it. The ones that do talk about it are least likely to kill themselves. Now, that may not be absolutely true, and I'm sure there's plenty of people in the world that have killed themselves and talked about it. But it's usually said that somebody who talks about wanting to kill themselves is least likely to kill themselves compared to somebody who doesn't talk about it. Now, again, I've never heard Kurt Cobain say that he was a depressed guy. I've only heard him say he was in pain, and dealing with the pain, the only way he could was to take heroin. That relieved some of the pain. That doesn't make him a druggie that is depressed. That makes him somebody who's trying to take care of his ailments. And, as far as he said, he tried prescriptions. He tried eating certain things. The only thing that would take away that pain was the heroin, which I'm sure led him down roads that could have contributed to suicidal thoughts. Like, I don't doubt that. But according to this new forensic report, I mean, it was clearly not a suicide. Like, and this isn't anything new. I've heard this talked about. I've heard people look at the police reports years ago. I've listened to audiobooks. I've seen theories about what went down, and Courtney Love's involvement, Mark Lanigan's involvement. And most of the time, the conclusion is Kurt Cobain wanted to leave Nirvana, and he wanted to divorce Courtney Love. And that isn't usually something a suicidal person would even talk about. They would probably not think of future plans. Like, to me, that's forward thinking. That's thinking future wise. So the story changes from a depressed guy who committed suicide to a guy that was, well, um, who was wealthy as all can be, who had full control of Nirvana, and wanted to get rid of that, which would have meant people would have lost a lot of money. Courtney Love would have lost a lot of money. Dave Grohl would have lost a lot of money. I think it was Atlantic Records would have lost a lot of money. So now there's vested interest in him not leaving Nirvana. So, yes, there's really only one way to get the rights to that, and that is for Kurt Cobain to not be alive anymore. Because now all those rights go to Courtney Love and the ex-Nirvana members and Atlantic Records, who made millions and millions of dollars off. People made so much money off Kurt Cobain's death. Now that's where it gets interesting. Because people had things to gain from his death. I don't ever see Courtney Love talking about, let's reopen this case. I don't think she would even want that to be the case. And for somebody that was supposedly in love with Kurt Cobain, you might want to have justice if there's foul play. She doesn't seem to want any justice, which is interesting. Dave Grohl doesn't seem to want any justice. A lot of people would go down if this was classified as a murder. So you would have, a whole scene of music would be destroyed if this was classified as a murder. Hence why probably Seattle Police Department does not want to touch it. They do not want to reopen the case, even though it's pretty clear, considering the man had, due to the forensic reports, he was already pretty much brain dead, probably being shot in the face. His fluids in his stomach were choking him to death prior to being shot in the face. He had 3 times a level of a normal heroin user in his body, which doesn't shock me, because I've listened to a lot of these druggies, these heroin guys, these ex-musicians, these current musicians, and their levels of what they can take for heroin are astronomical. So, to me, it doesn't necessarily, his level of heroin probably could have been very high if he was an extreme user, which I don't really hear. From the opinions I gather and listening to Kurt Cobain, he was fully functional. He was playing at a high level, and you don't do that very well on heroin. But it's been done. So, in my opinion, no, I don't think he was as much of a junkie as people like to claim he was. He seemed to be fully functional for the most part. So he might be able to take a high level of heroin, but 3 times, and that's 3 times at a normal user. So that's where it gets interesting. The forensics come back that he would not have been even conscious, let alone able to hold a shotgun in his hand. So, and then there's multiple other things. There's no blood splatter, or very little blood splatter. His hands don't seem to have any effects of the shotgun. If you're holding a shotgun to your face, your hands might have burn marks or blood splatter. But if he's barely breathing and his blood, levels are already super low, you shoot somebody in the face, you're not going to have much blood splatter. So I could see the argument there, and again, you don't really have to make an argument for me. Plenty of people gained from Kurt Cobain's death, and the poor guy, well, nobody deserves a shotgun blast to the face. I don't care who you are. And that's the thing, I don't really ever hear anyone talk bad about Kurt Cobain. I hear a lot of jealousy. I loved Chris Cornell, I loved Lane Staley, Jerry Cantrell. They don't talk highly of Kurt Cobain, but they don't talk like he was a bad guy. I've never heard anyone say he was a bad guy. Moody and, shy, I've heard that. But never he was a piece of crap that deserved a shotgun blast to the face. Never heard that. And, the main point here is that turned a whole generation of kids and young adults to suicide hotlines, Ritalin, the therapist. Prior to the 1990s, you never heard a 13-year-old being depressed. You didn't have school therapists. You definitely didn't have suicide hotlines. So, these things were in the pop culture because of Kurt Cobain. Again, as soon as this news report went out that Kurt Cobain committed suicide, the first things people said was how depressed he was. I even Neil Young say I was gonna call him, check up on him, because he was clearly struggling. Like, how was he clearly struggling? He was making millions of dollars. He was on top of the world. He seemed to be wanting to get everything under his control as much as he can, due to wanting to quit Nirvana and divorce Courtney Love. Now that seems like a guy that's headed in the right direction, not falling into a spiral. And I'd be willing to bet Neil Young never even talked to Kurt Cobain, let alone was going to call him and say, "Oh man, I know how depressed you are. Let me give you some good advice." Like, I don't know about that. So a lot of people rode that coattail. And again, what seems to be the case is this was agenda driven. Not only did multiple people gain from Kurt Cobain's death, they got to change a whole generation of 90s kids who pretty much didn't have a care in the world. I was born in the 80s, so living as a young boy in the 90s, like, we didn't have a care in the world. None of my friends were depressed. None of my friends were on Ritalin. We were laughing, having a good time, and again, could care less about what the struggles of the world were. But they did affect a lot of kids. I had a lot of friends and people around me that loved Kurt Cobain, and that was heavy for them. And the last point I'll make is he is, up until Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington, the only man that ever killed themselves at that high level of musicianship due to suicide was Kurt Cobain. You had Sid Vicious kill themselves from Sex Pistols. The guy was on trial for murder. He was a bad dude. He didn't really have any money, struggling his whole life. That wasn't an agenda story because you couldn't use it. The lead singer of NXS supposedly killed himself. What seems to be the case is it was self-asphyxiation due to, a sexual practice he was doing. Again, it wasn't suicide because depression. So the only person to kill themselves due to depression was Kurt Cobain, until Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington. And there's a major issue with their deaths too. But the first thing people did was compare it to Kurt Cobain, because there's no other way to compare it. There's nothing else to compare it to. Kurt Cobain is the only one that ever supposedly did that, up until Chris Cornell. And now they're saying it was a homicide, not a suicide. So that's a big issue, in my opinion. You know, with all these files getting released, all this disclosure due to the mainstream media, you know, from 2012 to 2017, that was full disclosure. All these things people are finding out right now, you could find easily from that, just with a little research. Now that mainstream media is talking about it, it's supposedly true. You know, like, people were seeing this left and right from 2012 to 2017, telling people, nobody believed them because it wasn't mainstream media saying it. Now mainstream media is saying it, so everyone believes it. Even though mainstream media, nobody believes mainstream media. Doesn't make any sense. But, so yeah, there's a lot more I could say about it, and I hope my point is clear that this Kurt Cobain suicide that is now being called a homicide changed the whole 90s. It changed the whole generation of people and taught them about suicide and depression. When prior to that, it really wasn't an issue. But because Kurt Cobain killed himself, it became an issue. Still to this day. But, you know, nobody deserves that. And again, it just seems agenda-based. It was good for pushing an agenda. And a lot of people made a lot of money off of the guy's death. So hopefully this does become more than what it currently is, because again, it was an independent research. So the police department doesn't want to touch it. Nobody wants to reopen the case. So, but if it would to be declared an actual homicide, that would have changed the entire grunge era. So, a lot to unpack, but thanks for